There was a door no one dared to cross. For 17 years Miriam walked the stone corridors of the forgotten palace, where she worked as a copyist, and for 17 years that door remained closed, sealed by chains no one remembered placing. They said there was a throne on the other side. They said no one could enter. They also said that whoever heard their own name coming from that place would never be the same again. Miriam never believed those stories until the night she heard her voice whispered through the cracks in the ancient wood, soft as breath, undeniable as fate. She was 29 years old and had learned to make herself invisible. In the palace's vast archive, where dust settled on manuscripts no one would ever read again, Miriam copied texts in silence. Her hand moved across parchment with mechanical precision, reproducing words she never truly absorbed. The work required no thought, no presence, no soul. It was perfect for someone who had spent her entire life trying not to be noticed. Her mother had taught her that lesson early in the small apartment where they'd lived before the illness took her. Women who stand out are women who suffer. Her mother would say, stirring soup with hands that trembled from exhaustion. Women who ask questions are women who disappear. Keep your head down. Do your work. Don't let them see you. So Miriam had become a shadow, a pair of hands that moved in lamplight, a figure so unremarkable that even the other copyists forgot her name by the end of each day. The palace itself was a ruin pretending to be a residence. Built centuries ago by a dynasty no historian could fully trace, it stood on the edge of a city that had grown around it like moss around a stone. The architecture belonged to no single era. Gothic arches opened into chambers with copper-lined walls. Hallways stretched longer than they should, turning at angles that defied geometry. Windows looked out onto courtyards that seemed to shift position, depending on the time of day. Some mornings Miriam would glance through a window on the 3rd floor and see a garden of dead roses. By evening the same window would reveal a courtyard of cracked marble, empty except for a single fountain that had run dry decades ago. The servants whispered that the palace was alive in some way, that it rearranged itself according to moods no one could predict. But Miriam thought the truth was simpler. The building was old, and old things settle in strange ways. Old things creak and groan and play tricks on the mind. Most rooms were abandoned. The copyist worked in the eastern wing, in an archive that climbed 3 stories high, lined with shelves that groaned under the weight of forgotten knowledge. The kitchens operated in the basement, staffed by a handful of cooks who prepared meals no one seemed to eat. A skeleton crew of servants maintained the facade of order in a building that had long ago surrendered to entropy. No one knew who owned the palace anymore. Some said it was state property, maintained by a government office that had forgotten why it needed maintaining. Others claimed it belonged to a family that had died out decades ago, leaving behind nothing but debts and crumbling stone. Miriam suspected the truth was simpler than any story. No one wanted it. It was too strange, too cold, too full of whispers that didn't quite sound like wind. The forbidden door stood at the end of the western corridor, a passage Miriam only walked when delivering manuscripts to the restricted archive. That section of the palace was colder than the rest, as if heat couldn't penetrate the thick stone walls. The lamps burned dimmer there, their flames struggling against a darkness that felt heavier than it should. And at the very end, past rows of locked doors and empty chambers, stood the door that no one opened. It was massive, at least 10 feet tall, carved from black wood that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The surface was smooth, polished by time or by hands that had touched it long ago. The chains wrapped around it were thick as a man's wrist, covered in a patina that looked less like rust and more like fossilized time. No lock held them in place. They simply existed, as if the door itself had grown them like iron vines. Above the threshold, barely visible in the dim light, were symbols carved deep into the stone. Miriam had never been able to read them. They looked like writing from a language that had died before language itself was born. Sometimes when she stood close enough, the symbols seemed to move, rearranging themselves into patterns that almost made sense, like words forming on the edge of understanding before slipping away. But mostly they were just marks, old marks in old stone, meaning nothing to anyone alive. She had passed that door hundreds of times over 17 years, and hundreds of times she had felt nothing. Just the usual cold of the western wing, the usual silence that lived in forgotten places. Just the weight of the manuscripts in her arms and the echo of her footsteps on stone floors that had been walked for centuries. But on the night of her 29th birthday, something changed. She was carrying a stack of illuminated pages to the restricted archive, walking the corridor as she always did when she heard it. Her name, not shouted, not called, whispered, as if someone stood just on the other side of the door, lips pressed to the wood, breathing the syllables into existence. Miriam. The sound was so soft she thought she'd imagined it. She stopped, manuscript pages clutched against her chest, and stared at the door. The chains hung motionless. The corridor was empty. The lamplight flickered once, casting her shadow long and thin against the stone wall, and then steadied. She waited, holding her breath, listening for the sound to return. Nothing, just her heartbeat, loud in her ears like a drum beating in an empty room, and the distant echo of footsteps somewhere far above, someone walking in a part of the palace she'd never seen. She continued walking, delivered the manuscripts to the restricted archive, where an elderly clerk took them without looking up and returned to her desk. But the whisper followed her. All through the night, as she copied page after page of a treaty no one would ever enforce, she heard it in the back of her mind. Miriam, soft as silk, certain as stone. Not a question, but a statement. Not a request, but a command that was willing to wait as long as it took for her to obey. She didn't sleep that night. In her small room above the kitchens, she lay on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling, watching shadows move across the plaster. The palace was never truly quiet. It creaked and settled, groaned and sighed, as if breathing in its sleep. Pipes clanged in the walls. Wind whistled through gaps in the stone. Doors opened and closed somewhere in the distance, though she never saw anyone walking the halls after dark. But tonight the sounds felt different, purposeful, as if the building itself were trying to tell her something. As if every creak and groan were part of a language she was only now beginning to understand. She thought about the door. She thought about the chains. She thought about all the stories she'd heard over the years, whispered by servants who'd worked in the palace longer than she'd been alive. They said the throne room had been sealed after the last king died. They said he'd gone mad in his final days, refusing to leave the chamber, refusing to eat or sleep or see anyone. He'd sit on the throne day and night, they said, speaking to presences no one else could see, answering questions no one else had asked. His attendants would stand outside and hear him laughing, weeping, shouting in languages that didn't exist. And then one day the sounds stopped. The attendants waited for hours, then days, but the king never emerged. Finally they called for help, broke down the door, and found the chamber empty. No body, no bones, no sign that anyone had been there at all. Just the throne, massive and dark, sitting in the center of a space that felt too large for the dimensions of the palace, as if the room existed in a different geometry than the rest of the building. They sealed it again after that, wrapped chains around the new door they'd installed, and told everyone it was forbidden. Some doors, the old servants said, were meant to stay closed. Some rooms held things that should never be disturbed. And some thrones, they whispered when they thought no one was listening, never truly lose their king. They just wait for the next one to arrive. Miriam had always dismissed those stories as palace mythology, the kind of tales that accumulate in old buildings like layers of paint. Every place with history had its ghosts, its legends, its rooms where strange things supposedly happened. It didn't mean any of it was true. It just meant people needed stories to make sense of spaces they didn't understand. But now, lying in the dark with her name still echoing in her skull like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing, she wondered if dismissal had been easier than belief. She wondered what it meant to hear your name spoken by something that shouldn't have a voice. She wondered if she was losing her mind, if 17 years of copying dead words onto dead pages had finally fractured something inside her that couldn't be repaired. Sleep came eventually, thin and restless, full of dreams where she walked corridors that twisted back on themselves, chasing a voice that always stayed just out of reach. In the dreams, the palace was bigger than it was in waking life, stretching in all directions like a maze with no center and no exit. She'd turn a corner and find herself back where she started. She'd climb a staircase and end up in a basement. She'd open a door and see herself standing on the other side, staring back with eyes that didn't recognize her own face. And through it all, the whisper followed, saying her name over and over, patient and relentless, like water wearing down stone. She woke at dawn feeling more exhausted than she'd been before sleeping. Her body ached as if she'd been running all night. Her head throbbed with the echo of dreams she couldn't quite remember. She dressed in the same gray dress she wore every day, tied her dark hair back with the same frayed ribbon, and went down to the kitchens for breakfast. The cooks barely glanced at her as she filled a bowl with thin porridge and sat at the long table where the servants ate. No one spoke to her. No one ever did. She was part of the furniture, a fixture so familiar it became invisible. The day passed as all her days passed. She sat at her desk in the archive, copied manuscripts with mechanical precision, and tried not to think about the whisper. But the whisper had other plans. Every time her mind wandered, every time she paused to dip her quill in ink, she felt it rising in her chest like a tide. Miriam, not a sound but a presence. Not outside her but inside, as if her name had always lived in her bones and was only now making itself known. By midday, her hands were shaking so badly she had to stop working. She sat staring at the half-finished page, watching ink dry on parchment, and realized she couldn't remember what she'd been copying. The words meant nothing. They were just shapes, symbols as meaningless as the carvings above the forbidden's door. That evening she walked past the door again. She told herself she wasn't going out of her way. The restricted archive was in the western wing. It was part of her route, but she knew the truth. She wanted to hear it again. She wanted proof that the whisper had been real, that she wasn't unraveling in the silence of her own invisible life. She approached slowly, manuscript pages held loosely in her hands, and stopped 3 paces from the door. The chains hung as they always had, heavy and immovable. The symbols above the threshold seemed darker today, as if they'd absorbed more shadow overnight. She waited. The corridor was cold enough that her breath misted in the air. She counted her heartbeats. 1, 2, 10, 20, 50. Nothing happened. She felt a wave of relief mixed with disappointment, and turned to leave. Then she heard it again. Miriam. Closer this time. Not a whisper from behind the door, but from inside her own chest, as if her name had been carved into her ribs and was finally vibrating free. The sensation was so intense it felt physical, like hands reaching through her sternum and touching her heart. She gasped, stumbled backward, and the manuscripts fell from her hands, scattering across the stone floor. Pages fluttered like dying birds, settling in patterns that looked almost intentional. The sound echoed down the corridor, sharp and final, and when the echoes faded, the silence that followed felt alive. Not empty, but full, waiting. She gathered the pages with trembling hands and fled. Back to the archive, back to her desk, back to the safety of mechanical work that required no thought. But the whisper didn't leave. It lived in her now, a second pulse beneath her skin. Over the following days it grew stronger. She would be copying and suddenly feel her name bloom in her chest like a dark flower. She would be eating in the servants' hall and hear it beneath the clatter of dishes. She would be lying in bed and feel it thrumming in her bones, a rhythm that didn't match her heartbeat, but was somehow more fundamental, more true. It was calling her. She knew that now. Something behind the forbidden door wanted her to enter, and the wanting was patient, relentless, inevitable as gravity. Miriam began to research. The palace had a library, though it was rarely used, filled with books that were more dust than paper. Shelves climbed toward a vaulted ceiling, so high it disappeared into shadow. Ladders leaned against the walls, their rungs worn smooth by generations of hands that had climbed them searching for knowledge that might still matter. She spent her evenings there, pulling volumes from shelves that groaned under their weight, searching for any mention of the throne room, the last king, the sealing of the door. Most of what she found were fragments, references scattered across decades of records, hints that never quite cohered into a complete picture. But slowly, piece by piece, she assembled a story. There had been a dynasty centuries ago that ruled territories no current map acknowledged. They'd built the palace as a seat of power, a place where kings could hold court and make decisions that shaped the world. But these weren't ordinary kings. According to the texts, they'd discovered something, a way of seeing the world that went beyond the physical, a way of understanding the connections that held communities together, the invisible threads that linked every soul to every other soul. They'd built the throne as a tool, a focal point for that vision, and whoever sat on it could see those threads as clearly as others saw roads or rivers. They could see where the connections were strong, where they were weak, where they were breaking. And with that vision came power. The power to strengthen bonds or sever them, the power to unite people or drive them apart. the power to shape destiny itself. For generations, the dynasty had used the throne wisely. They'd built a kingdom that thrived because its people were connected, because the threads between them were strong and well tended. But then came a king who stayed too long, who sat on the throne day after day, year after year, until the vision consumed him, until he could no longer tell the difference between the threads and the people they connected, until he started seeing patterns no one else could see, making decisions no one else could understand. His advisors begged him to step down, to let someone else take his place, but he refused. He said the throne had chosen him, and a king chosen by the throne could never abandon his post. Not until someone else heard their name. One text, written in a crabbed hand that was almost illegible, mentioned that the king had claimed to hear voices. Not madness, the author insisted, though he sounded like he was trying to convince himself. The king said the throne spoke to him. It told him truths about the world that no living person should know. It showed him the architecture of human connection, the fragile lattice of trust and love and duty that kept civilization from collapsing into chaos. The more he listened, the more he changed. He stopped eating. He stopped sleeping. He sat on the throne day and night, speaking in languages his attendants didn't recognize, answering questions no one had asked. When they tried to remove him, he told them he couldn't leave. The throne had claimed him, and once claimed, a king belonged to the throne until someone else was called to take his place. Then one day the sounds stopped. The attendants waited outside the sealed chamber, listening for the king's voice, but heard nothing. Days passed, weeks. Finally, they forced the door open and found the room empty. No body, no bones. No sign anyone had been there. Just the throne, sitting in the center of a space that seemed to exist outside the normal dimensions, as if the room had grown larger in the king's absence. They tried to destroy it then, the throne, tried to burn it, break it, throw it into the river. But nothing they did made any mark on the wood. It sat there, untouched and untouchable, waiting. So they sealed the room again, wrapped chains around the door, and declared it forbidden. Let it wait forever, they said. Let it wait for someone who will never come. Miriam read that passage 3 times, each time feeling her chest tighten with a certainty she couldn't explain. She closed the book and sat in the library's cold silence, watching dust motes drift through a shaft of moonlight that fell through the high windows. Outside, the city was settling into sleep. Inside, the palace breathed and creaked, holding secrets in every shadow. She thought about her life, about the careful invisibility she'd cultivated over 29 years, about her mother's warnings, her mother's fear, her mother's desperate belief that safety lay in being small, about the years spent copying other people's words because she'd never believed she had words of her own worth speaking, about the fire she sometimes felt deep inside herself, a heat she'd learned to suppress because it scared her, because it felt too large for the shape of her life, because her mother had taught her that fire in a woman was dangerous. What if the whisper wasn't madness? What if it was the opposite? What if it was the first true thing that had ever called her name? What if 17 years of invisibility had been the real madness, and this whisper was the cure? She started walking past the door every day, sometimes multiple times, even when she had no reason to be in the western wing. She would stand before it, close her eyes, and listen. The whisper was always there now, constant and clear, saying her name with a tenderness that felt almost like love. Miriam, as if she were precious, as if she mattered, as if she were exactly the person the throne had been waiting for all these years. She began to notice details she'd missed before. The chains weren't locked. There was no mechanism holding them closed, no padlock or seal. They were just wrapped around the door handles, heavy enough to discourage casual investigation, but not actually preventing entry. She could unwrap them if she wanted to. She could do it right now in the middle of the day, with copyists working just a few corridors away. The only thing stopping her was fear. And increasingly, she wasn't sure if the fear was of what she'd find behind the door, or of what she'd discover about herself. The door itself had no visible hinges on the outside, which meant it opened inward, and the symbols above the threshold, when she looked at them long enough, seemed to shift. They'd rearrange themselves into patterns that almost looked like letters, almost looked like her own name written in a script she'd never learned but somehow recognized. Sometimes she'd stare at them until her vision blurred, until the symbols seemed to lift off the stone and hang in the air before her like words made of smoke. And in those moments she'd feel the whisper intensify, feel it vibrating in her chest with an urgency that made her heart race and her hands shake. The other copyists began to avoid her. She'd become strange. They whispered when they thought she couldn't hear. She stared too much at nothing. She muttered to herself while she worked. She walked the corridors at odd hours, her footsteps echoing through the empty palace long after everyone else had gone to bed. One of the senior archivists, a man with gray hair and tired eyes who'd worked in the palace longer than Miriam had been alive, pulled her aside one afternoon and asked if she was unwell, if she needed time away from work, if there was anything he could do to help. Miriam told him she was fine, but the lie felt thin even to her own ears. She wasn't fine. She was coming apart or coming together. She couldn't tell which. All she knew was that the whisper had become a roar, a command that vibrated in every cell of her body, and she was running out of strength to resist. She stopped eating properly. Food tasted like ash in her mouth. Sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams where the throne called to her in her mother's voice, in her own voice, and voices that belonged to no one she'd ever met. She'd wake gasping, her sheets soaked with sweat, her name still ringing in her ears. During the day she'd sit at her desk and stare at blank parchment, her quill forgotten in her hand, ink dripping onto the wood. She was losing time. Minutes would pass, then hours, and she'd have no memory of where they went. The other copyists started taking her manuscripts to the restricted archive themselves, no longer trusting her to make the walk alone. And through it all the door waited, patient, inevitable, knowing she would come. On the night of the new moon, when darkness was absolute and the palace seemed to hold its breath, Miriam made her decision. She waited until the last lamp in the archive was extinguished, until the last footsteps faded down the corridors, until even the kitchen fires had been banked, and the only sounds were the building's endless creaking and settling. She took a lamp from her room, one of the old brass ones with a glass chimney that cast a warm, steady light, and walked to the western wing. Her footsteps echoed in the empty corridors, loud enough that anyone still awake would hear her, but she didn't try to muffle them. There was no point. If she was going to do this, she was going to do it honestly, without sneaking or hiding. She'd spent 17 years being invisible. Tonight she would be seen, even if the only witness was herself. When she reached the door, she set the lamp on the floor and stood for a long moment, looking at the chains. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, in her wrists, and her temples. Her hands were shaking. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps that misted in the cold air. She was terrified, not of what might be behind the door, but of what it would mean if she crossed this threshold. Once she opened it, she couldn't pretend anymore. Couldn't pretend the whisper wasn't real. Couldn't pretend her life of invisibility had been a choice rather than a prison. Couldn't pretend she didn't want something more than survival. She placed both hands on the chains. They were cold, so cold they burned her palms, but she didn't pull away. She unwrapped them slowly, link by link, letting them fall to the stone floor with sounds like iron bells tolling in an empty church. The weight of them surprised her. Each length of chain had to weigh 30 pounds or more, yet they'd hung there for decades, without any support except the door itself. When the last chain dropped with a final echoing clang, the door stood bare before her, unguarded, waiting. She picked up the lamp and held it high, illuminating the symbols above the threshold. They were moving now, she was sure of it, rearranging themselves into patterns that spelled her name in a language older than words. She placed her hand on the wood. It was smooth beneath her palm, warm despite the cold of the corridor, almost alive. She could feel something through it, a vibration so low it was more sensation than sound, like a heartbeat that came from somewhere deep inside the wood, or beyond it, or beneath it. She pushed. The door swung inward without sound, without resistance, as if it weighed nothing at all, as if it had been waiting for her touch and her touch alone. Cold air rushed out, carrying with it a smell that was neither pleasant nor unpleasant, just old, ancient. The smell of a place that had been sealed for so long it had developed its own atmosphere, its own climate, its own rules. She stepped through. The throne room was vast, impossibly vast. The ceiling disappeared into darkness, so complete it felt like looking into the void between stars. The walls were lined with columns carved from black stone, each one easily 6 feet in diameter, and covered in the same symbols that marked the door. They rose into the darkness like trees in a petrified forest, silent and ancient and watching. The floor was polished to a mirror shine, some kind of black marble that reflected the lamplight in fragments, sending it skittering across the surface like living things running from the intrusion of her presence. The dimensions of the room made no sense. It was far too large to fit within the palace's western wing. If she'd drawn a map based on her years of walking the corridors, this space shouldn't exist. It should extend through walls and into the city beyond. But here it was, real, undeniable, existing according to rules that had nothing to do with architecture or geometry or anything else that made sense in the world she knew. And in the center of the room, raised on a dais of 7 steps, sat the throne. It was massive, carved from a single piece of wood so dark it seemed to be made of shadow given form. The backrest rose at least 12 feet high, adorned with intricate carvings that hurt to look at too long. Faces, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all different, all detailed, all staring out with eyes that seemed to follow her as she moved. Among the faces were hands reaching, grasping, holding, releasing, and flames carved with such precision she could almost feel their heat, and crowns, some simple, some ornate, all broken or cracked or fallen. The patterns intertwined in ways that made her dizzy, that made her feel like she was looking at something four-dimensional rendered in 3 dimensions, something that existed in a space her mind couldn't quite comprehend. The armrests were smooth, worn by centuries of touch, curved in a way that looked organic, as if the throne had grown rather than been carved, and the seat itself was wide enough for 2 people, though only one had ever sat there. The wood was darker there, stained by contact with something she didn't want to think about. Time, maybe, or the essence of all the people who'd sat there before, their presence soaked into the wood like blood into soil. Miriam walked forward. Each step felt heavier than the last. The air in the room was thick, resistant, as if she were walking through water that got deeper with every pace. Her lamplight barely touched the edges of the darkness. The shadows here weren't normal shadows. They had weight, substance, presence. They pressed in from all sides, watching her progress with attention that felt almost hungry. She could feel the whisper growing stronger with every step. Not a sound anymore, but a presence that filled her chest, her throat, her mind. It was no longer saying her name. It was saying yes, over and over. Yes, as if she'd asked a question and this was the answer. As if she'd been searching her whole life and had finally found what she was looking for. She climbed 7 steps. Each one felt like a decision. A choice to continue, to not turn back, to commit to whatever came next. Her legs trembled. Sweat ran down her back despite the cold. By the time she reached the top, she was breathing hard, her heart slamming against her ribs, like something trying to escape. She stood before the throne and looked at it, really looked at it, and understood with sudden, terrifying clarity that this was not an object. It was alive. Not in the way a person is alive, or even an animal, but in the way a river is alive, a mountain is alive, an old forest is alive. It was a presence that had existed long before the palace was built, long before the dynasty rose and fell, long before human beings had ever conceived of kings or kingdoms. It was something older than language, older than memory, older than the concept of age itself, and it had been waiting for centuries, patient as stone for someone whose soul carried the right fire, for someone strong enough to hear their name and brave enough to answer. Miriam sat down. The moment her body made contact with the throne, the world exploded into light. Not physical light, not anything her eyes could see, but something deeper, something that bypassed her senses entirely and burned directly into her consciousness. She felt her mind expand or break, or both, felt the walls of her perception shatter and rebuild in new configurations, felt herself become something other than what she'd been, while somehow remaining exactly who she'd always been. And then she saw them, the threads, thousands of them at first, then millions, then billions, then numbers that stopped having meaning because they encompassed everything, every living thing that existed, every soul that had ever drawn breath or ever would. They stretched out in every direction, connecting each person to every other person, forming a web so intricate and beautiful it made her want to weep. Some threads were bright and strong, pulsing with the energy of deep connection. Parent to child, friend to friend, lover to lover, teacher to student. These bonds glowed like filaments of light, warm and living and necessary. Other threads were thin, dim, barely visible. Neighbors who never spoke. Strangers who passed each other daily without acknowledgement. Potential connections that had never been realized. And some threads were frayed, hanging by a few final fibers, about to snap completely. Relationships broken by time or distance or betrayal. Communities torn apart by fear or anger or apathy. She saw the invisible architecture that held the world together. The fragile lattice of trust and love and duty that kept civilization from collapsing into chaos. She saw how every kind word, every gesture of compassion, every moment of genuine connection strengthened the web, and how every act of cruelty, every moment of indifference, every choice to look away and not see another person's humanity weakened it. She saw the whole vast system laid out before her like a living organism, breathing and growing and dying and being reborn moment by moment, sustained only by the collective will of everyone to keep trying, keep connecting, keep caring even when it was hard. And she saw something else, a darkness moving through the web, not a creature or a force, but an absence, the opposite of connection. It moved like rot through wood, touching threads and making them brittle, making them snap. And wherever threads snapped, people became isolated, lonely, afraid, and afraid people built walls. They stopped trusting. They stopped reaching out. They stopped believing that connection was possible or worth the risk. And as more people withdrew, more threads broke, and the darkness spread faster, feeding on itself, growing stronger with every soul it touched. She saw where it came from, not from some external evil, but from fear itself. The fear that tells people to stay small, to stay silent, to never reach for more than survival. The fear her mother had taught her. The fear that had kept her copying dead words for 17 years, invisible and safe and utterly alone. It was the same fear infecting millions of people, telling them that vulnerability was weakness, that reaching out was dangerous, that the only safe place was inside walls, so thick nothing could get in or out. And it was killing the world. Not dramatically, not with fire or war or obvious destruction, but slowly, quietly, one severed thread at a time, until people lived in cities full of strangers, walked past each other without seeing, died without anyone noticing they were gone. The vision shifted. She saw the future if nothing changed. Cities burning, not with fire but with apathy. People walking through streets like ghosts, present but not really there, alive but not living. She saw kingdoms falling, not to war but to isolation. Leaders sitting on thrones they didn't deserve, speaking words they didn't mean, making decisions that broke bonds they didn't understand existed. She saw families fracturing, communities dissolving, the web growing thinner and thinner until it couldn't hold anymore, until it tore completely, until every soul was alone in the dark, wondering why everything felt so empty. But then the vision shifted again, showing her something else, showing her what could be. She saw herself not as she was, but as she could become, strong where she'd been weak, certain where she'd been doubtful, unafraid where she'd been terrified. The fire in her chest, the one she'd spent her whole life trying to suppress, burned bright and clear, not consuming her, but illuminating her from within, showing her the true shape of her soul. And she was reaching out, touching the threads not with hands, but with will, with attention, with the simple act of seeing people and letting them know they were seen, mending what was broken, strengthening what was weak, reminding people that they carried fire too, that they had the power to connect, to care, to tend the bonds that held everything together. She saw herself in a market square speaking to a merchant who'd forgotten why he worked, saw the thread between him and his daughter suddenly brighten, pulsing with renewed purpose. Saw herself in a village where neighbors had stopped speaking, her presence somehow catalyzing conversations that had been needed for years. Saw herself in cities and towns and forgotten places, everywhere the web was weakest, everywhere threads were about to break. And everywhere she went, things changed. Not because she was powerful or special, but because she remembered something everyone else had forgotten, that every soul carried a fire, that every person had the capacity to connect, that the bonds between people were the only things that truly mattered, the only things that could save anyone from the darkness. She saw that the work would never be finished, that the darkness would always exist as long as fear existed, and fear was part of being human. But she also saw that the work was worth doing anyway, that every thread she strengthened, every connection she helped someone remember, mattered. Not because it would save the world forever, but because it would save it today. And tomorrow she'd do it again, and the day after that. And slowly, one moment at a time, the web would grow stronger. People would remember how to see each other. The darkness would still spread, but it would have opposition, resistance, people who refused to let fear make them invisible. The vision showed her companions, people she would meet along the way who recognized the fire in her because it echoed the fire in them. A blacksmith who'd lost his son and thought he'd lost his purpose. A teacher who'd stopped believing her work mattered. A soldier who'd forgotten he could use his strength to protect rather than destroy. They would become fellow keepers, learning to see the threads and tend them, each in their own way. Building a network of people who remembered, who chose connection over isolation, who carried their fire openly rather than hiding it in fear. And finally, the vision showed her the truth she'd been running from her whole life, that she mattered, that she'd always mattered, that her mother had been wrong, not because she was cruel, but because she was afraid. And fear makes people teach their children terrible lessons in the name of love. That invisibility wasn't safety. It was death. A slow death of the soul. A severing of all the threads that could have connected her to the world until she was alone even when surrounded by people. And that the whisper calling her name wasn't trying to harm her. It was trying to save her. To wake her up. To remind her that she carried a fire that could break rules, awaken others, bend the very fabric of destiny, if she only had the courage to let it burn. The vision faded slowly, like dawn light spreading across a dark landscape. Miriam was still sitting on the throne, her hands gripping the armrests, her body rigid with the intensity of what she'd seen. She could feel the throne beneath her, solid and real, but she could also feel something else, a mark, a claim, a change so fundamental it went deeper than flesh or bone. The throne had looked inside her, seen everything she was, and everything she could be, and decided she was worthy, not perfect, not without fear or doubt, but worthy anyway. Chosen not because she was strong, but because she was willing to become strong. Chosen not because she had all the answers, but because she was brave enough to ask the questions. She stood slowly, legs shaking, and looked down at her hands. They looked the same, Same long fingers, same calluses from years of holding a quill, same small scar on her left thumb from a kitchen accident when she was 12. But they weren't the same. She could feel it. They'd touched something beyond the physical world, and that touch had changed their purpose. These weren't the hands of a copyist anymore. They were the hands of someone who would touch lives, mend bonds, tend the invisible threads that held humanity together. They were the hands of a keeper. She turned and walked back down the 7 steps. Each one felt lighter now, as if gravity had loosened its hold on her, or as if she'd grown strong enough to carry her own weight with ease. She crossed the throne room, her lamplight pushing back shadows that no longer felt threatening, just old, just waiting, just part of the room's nature. When she reached the door, she looked back one last time. The throne sat in the darkness, patient and eternal, already waiting for whoever would come next, because this was its nature, to call those who carried the right fire, to show them what the world truly was, to give them a burden and a purpose and a choice. She stepped through the doorway, and the door swung shut behind her with a sound like finality. She didn't touch the chains, but they wrapped themselves around the handles anyway, settling into place with soft metallic whispers. The symbols above the threshold glowed faintly for a moment, then faded back to dull stone. The corridor was exactly as she'd left it, cold, silent, empty, but she was not the same person who'd entered. She walked through the palace as dawn light began to filter through the high windows, turning the stone from black to gray to gold. The other copyists would wake soon. The servants would light the fires. The palace would resume its daily pretense of normalcy. But Miriam knew she couldn't stay. The throne had shown her the work ahead, and that work didn't live in archives or corridors. It lived out in the world, in the spaces between people, in the places where threads were fraying and fires were dying. She went to her room, gathered the few possessions she owned, a spare dress, a hairbrush, the leather-bound journal her mother had given her years ago, and packed them in a small bag. Then she sat at the tiny desk by the window and wrote a single sentence on a scrap of parchment. I heard my name. She left it on the desk where the senior archivist would find it, along with the quill she'd used for 17 years, and walked out of her room, out of the palace into the rising sun. The city was waking around her as she walked through its streets, shopkeepers opening their doors, workers heading to jobs, children running with bread in their hands and laughter in their voices. She'd lived here for 17 years and barely seen any of it, too focused on making herself invisible to notice the life happening around her. But now she saw everything. The threads connecting these people, bright and dim, and frayed and strong. The places where bonds were healthy, and the places where they were breaking. The work that needed doing. She stopped in a small square where a fountain still functioned, water trickling from the mouth of a stone fish into a basin worn smooth by centuries of use. An old woman sat on the fountain's edge, feeding crumbs to pigeons. Miriam could see her thread, thin and lonely, barely connecting to anyone. She walked over and sat beside the woman. For a moment they were silent, just 2 people on a fountain hedge, watching birds fight over bread. Then Miriam spoke. "That's a beautiful shawl." The woman looked at her, surprised to be addressed, and smiled. "It was my daughter's. She made it before she moved away." They talked for 10 minutes, nothing profound, just conversation. But Miriam could see the woman's thread brightening, strengthening, as someone finally saw her and reminded her that she existed, that she mattered, that the world was still full of connection if you knew how to look. When Miriam left, the woman was sitting up straighter, her eyes clearer, her expression less lonely. And so it began. The work, the tending, the endless, necessary, beautiful work of keeping people connected to each other and to themselves. Miriam walked out of the city into the territories beyond, places she'd only read about in manuscripts. She had no plan, no destination, only the instinct the throne had given her. A pull in her chest that guided her toward places where the threads were weakest, where people had forgotten how to see each other, where the darkness was spreading fastest. She found herself in villages where neighbors no longer spoke, and towns where leaders had forgotten how to listen, in cities where people moved like ghosts, disconnected and alone. And in each place she began to work, not with grand gestures or loud declarations, not with magic or miracles or anything that would attract attention, but with quiet, careful attention to the invisible bonds holding communities together. She would sit in a market and watch how people moved, how they avoided each other's eyes, how they hurried past without touching, without acknowledging each other's existence. And then she would approach someone, a merchant, maybe, a mother carrying a child, a young man who looked lost, and she would say something simple, "I see you." Just 3 words, spoken with a sincerity that cut through the noise of fear and isolation like a blade through cloth. "I see you." And in that moment she would reach out with the strange new sense the throne had given her, the ability to perceive the threads and touch the one connecting that person to others. Give it a gentle pull, a reminder that it existed, that they weren't alone, that the bonds were still there, just forgotten, just waiting to be remembered. Sometimes people would stare at her as if she'd spoken a foreign language. Sometimes they would cry, overwhelmed by the sudden awareness of connection they'd forgotten existed. Sometimes they would simply nod, and something in their expression would soften, would open, and they would turn and speak to the person beside them, and a thread would strengthen, a bond would mend. The web would grow a little stronger in that place for that moment. It was slow work, exhausting work. Every day she felt the weight of the throne's vision pressing down on her, the knowledge that the darkness was still spreading, still severing threads faster than she alone could mend them. She saw relationships breaking that she couldn't fix, communities fracturing that she arrived too late to save, people drowning in loneliness while she was miles away tending other bonds. The work was impossible, the task too large, the darkness too strong, but she also felt something else, the fire in her chest growing stronger, fueled not by her own strength, but by every connection she restored, every bond she reminded people they carried. Every moment she saw someone remember that they weren't alone. She began to understand what the throne had meant when it chose her. She wasn't meant to save the world alone. That was impossible. One person, no matter how dedicated, couldn't tend all the threads, couldn't reach all the people, couldn't stand in all the places where the darkness spread. But she could remind people that they had the power to save themselves, that every soul carried a fire, that every person could tend the threads around them, could choose connection over isolation, could refuse to let fear make them invisible. She was the keeper, yes, but the bond itself belonged to everyone. The months turned to years. Miriam traveled constantly, moving from place to place with no fixed home. She slept in inns when she had coin, in barns when she didn't. She ate what people offered or what she could forage. She wore her clothes until they were more patch than original fabric, then found or traded for new ones. She owned nothing that couldn't fit in the small bag she carried. Her body grew lean and strong from constant walking. Her face grew weathered from sun and wind. Her hands, once soft from copying manuscripts, became calloused from real work, helping people rebuild fences, carrying water for communities, holding the hands of people who were dying alone. And everywhere she went, she found others, people who recognized something different in her, who felt the pull of the threads she tended and chose to help. They came from all walks of life, all backgrounds, all stories. A blacksmith who'd lost his son to plague and thought he'd lost his reason to live, until Miriam reminded him that his work connected him to everyone in the village, that every tool he forged was a thread between him and those who used it, that his son's death didn't erase the bonds he'd built, just changed their nature. The blacksmith, whose name was Torn, began to see his work differently, started teaching apprentices, started building not just tools, but relationships, started understanding that his forge was a place where the community gathered, where people talked while waiting for their work, where bonds were formed and maintained. He became one of Miriam's first companions, following her from place to place, teaching other craftspeople what she'd taught him. There was Alara, a teacher who'd stopped believing her students cared, who'd stood in front of classrooms for 20 years and watched children grow more disconnected, more isolated, more focused on themselves, and less on each other. She'd been about to quit, to walk away from teaching forever, when Miriam showed her the invisible web of influence she carried, showed her how every word she spoke created threads, how some students would remember one sentence she said for the rest of their lives, how her presence in that classroom mattered in ways she couldn't see, but were no less real. Alara wept when she saw it, the threads spreading out from her to dozens of students, and from those students to others, creating patterns that would ripple through generations. She went back to teaching with new eyes, new purpose, new understanding of what her work truly meant. And there was Cale, a former soldier who'd left the army after seeing too much death, too much destruction. He'd become a wanderer, drinking to forget, sleeping in alleys, convinced he was worthless, that his only skill was violence, that the world would be better without him. Miriam found him on a bridge one night, looking down at the water below with a kind of stillness that meant he was making a decision. She sat beside him and said nothing for a long time, just sat, being present, letting him know he wasn't alone. Finally he spoke. "I've only ever broken things, broken people, broken bonds. I don't know how to build." And Miriam said, "Then learn." She showed him how his strength could protect the bonds others were building, how his experience could teach young people about the cost of violence, preventing them from making his mistakes, how his very presence, standing guard while communities rebuilt, gave people the safety they needed to open up, to connect, to trust. Cale became a guardian for the communities Miriam helped heal, staying behind when she moved on, protecting the fragile new bonds until they were strong enough to protect themselves. These three and others like them became Miriam's companions, though she never called them followers. They were fellow keepers, each learning to see the threads and tend them in their own way. They traveled together sometimes, split up to cover more ground other times, but they all understood the same truth. The work was impossible for one person, but possible for many. The darkness was strong, but so was the fire they carried. The bonds were fragile, but they were also resilient, capable of being mended, of growing back stronger than before, if tended with care. And slowly, imperceptibly, like spring coming after a hard winter, things began to change. Villages that had been dying started to thrive. Neighbors who hadn't spoken in years found reasons to talk. Communities that had fractured began to heal, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to keep going, enough to keep trying. Towns where people had been isolated started to see connections reform, strangers becoming friends, friends becoming family, the web growing stronger in places that had been weak. Miriam heard stories of other keepers appearing, people who'd never met her but who'd been inspired by those she'd helped. A woman who started organizing communal meals in her neighborhood, bringing people together over food and conversation. A man who began sitting in the park every day, available to anyone who needed to talk, who needed to be heard. Young people creating spaces where the lonely could find connection. Old people sharing wisdom they'd thought nobody wanted. The work was spreading, not through organization or hierarchy, but through inspiration, through people remembering that they carried fire and choosing to let it burn. But the darkness spread too. Miriam saw it everywhere she went. New technologies that promised connection but delivered isolation. Economic systems that forced people to compete rather than cooperate. Political movements that thrived on fear and division. The darkness had 1,000 faces, 1,000 strategies, all of them designed to sever threads, to make people afraid of each other, to convince them that walls were safer than bridges. And it was winning in some places, winning badly. She saw cities where the web had torn so completely that violence had become normal, where people walked past the suffering of others without even noticing, where children grew up never learning how to connect, never understanding that bonds were possible. In those places, Miriam's work felt hopeless. She'd spend months trying to help a community heal, only to watch it collapse again as soon as she left. She'd build connections that seemed strong, only to return years later and find them severed. She'd lose people she'd grown to care about, watch them give in to fear or despair, watch them choose isolation over the hard work of staying connected. The weight of it ground her down, made her question if anything she did mattered, made her wonder if the throne had been wrong to choose her. On those nights when the doubt was heaviest, she would think about the vision the throne had shown her, the web of threads stretching across the world, the fragile beauty of it, the impossible complexity of it, the way every single connection mattered, even the small ones, even the temporary ones, even the ones that eventually broke. Because they were still real while they lasted. They still had value. They still changed people in ways that rippled outward, creating effects she couldn't see, but were no less important. She remembered something Elara had told her once during a particularly difficult time. We're not trying to save everyone. We're just trying to remind people that they're worth saving, that the work is worth doing, that the bonds matter even when they're hard to maintain. And that's enough. It has to be enough. or we'll break trying to hold the whole world together by ourselves. Miriam was 43 years old when she returned to the palace. 14 years had passed since she'd walked out at dawn, carrying nothing but a small bag and a purpose she barely understood. In that time she'd traveled thousands of miles, had tended thousands of threads, had met hundreds of people and changed dozens of communities, had become someone she never would have recognized at 29. Her hair, once dark, now showed threads of gray at the temples. Her face bore lines that hadn't been there before, marks of laughter and grief in equal measure. Her body was strong but scarred, bearing the evidence of a life lived hard and purposefully. She looked like what she was, someone who'd seen too much and kept going anyway, someone who'd carried a burden that should have crushed her and had somehow learned to bear it with grace. The palace was falling apart. The eastern wing where she'd worked had collapsed completely, leaving only rubble and twisted metal beams. The windows were broken, letting in wind and rain and birds that nested in the empty halls. The servants were all gone. The archive abandoned. Most of the manuscripts she'd spent 17 years copying had been lost or stolen or destroyed by time and weather. The building was dying or already dead, just a shell waiting for someone to admit it was time to tear it down. But the western corridor still stood, and the forbidden door still waited. Chains wrapped around its handles, symbols glowing faintly in the dim light of late afternoon. Miriam stood before it for a long time, remembering the night she'd first heard her name, remembering the fear and the longing and the desperate need to know if she mattered. She'd been so young then, so afraid, so convinced that invisibility was the only way to survive. The throne had called her out of that fear and into purpose, had shown her that the fire she'd been suppressing was exactly what the world needed, had given her a burden that saved her life by giving her a reason to live it. She didn't need to enter now. The throne had already given her what she needed 14 years ago, but she placed her hand on the door anyway and whispered a single word, "Thank you." The wood pulsed beneath her palm, warm and alive, and she felt the throne's presence reach out to her one last time. Not to call her back, but to acknowledge her, to let her know that she'd done what it asked, that she'd remembered, that she'd tended, that she'd carried the fire, and that the work she'd started would continue long after she was gone, because she'd taught others to see what she saw, to carry what she carried, to tend the silent bonds that held everything together. She left the palace and returned to the world, to the work that would never truly be finished, because the silent bond was not a destination. It was a practice, a choice made every day, in every moment, to see the threads connecting souls and tend them with care. Some days the work felt impossible. Some days she failed more than she succeeded. Some days she wanted to give up, to walk away, to let someone else carry the burden. But she didn't, because the throne had chosen her, and she'd chosen to answer. And that choice, made once and renewed every morning, when she woke and decided to keep going, was the only thing that mattered. Miriam had been invisible once, a shadow moving through corridors, copying words that meant nothing. But the throne had called her name, and in answering she had become something no one could ignore, not because she was loud or powerful or grand, but because she carried a fire that reminded others of their own. And that fire, quiet as it was, had the power to break rules that said people couldn't change. to awaken in others the understanding that they mattered, that their connections mattered, that they were part of something larger than themselves, and to bend the course of destiny itself, one mended thread at a time, until the web grew strong enough to hold. Every hidden soul carries a fire that breaks rules, awakens kings, and bends destiny. If you've felt the weight of that fire burning inside you, if you've heard your own name whispered in the silence of your invisible life, share your story in the comments below. Let this be a space where souls who've learned to be small find permission to burn bright. Let this be where the keepers gather, those who understand that the strongest bonds are the ones the world cannot see. Remember to leave a like if this story touched something deep within you, something you thought no one else would understand. And subscribe to walk this path with others who know that the work is impossible and necessary and worth doing anyway. Until the next story, tend your fire, guard your threads. Remember that you matter more than you know. The world needs your light, even when you can't see it yourself.